Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be in Daniel chapter 12, where we read about the end of the book, the end of Daniel's life, and maybe the end of some other things as well. Chapter 12 and verse 1 starts off, "Now at that time, Michael," and the name Michael actually means, names always have meaning, especially in Hebrew. Mikal is who is like God. And it's a name that we've already seen in Daniel. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia was withstanding me. This angel shows up and is speaking to Daniel for 21 days. And then behold, Michael, and notice Michael hadn't been introduced prior to this, except that he's called one of the chief princes, came to help me. Likewise, Jude chapter 1 and verse 9, when we get there, but Michael the archangel, and talks about how he disputed with the devil and argued about the body of Moses, and then it goes on to develop a different argument. But notice Michael is called the archangel, the angel, and then the word arche attached to it as a prefix just means the beginning or the head, sort of the lead angel. And so that's how he's described in the book of Jude. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 7 envisions a war in heaven where there's Michael and his angels. If he's the archangel, then he's heading up other angels, waging war against the dragon. And of course, the dragon in Revelation represents Satan. And so at this time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. Now, notice how it points out at that time. Daniel chapter 11, and this is, a continuation of the book. Daniel 11 had been talking about Antiochus IV, the one who called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, and the abomination of desolation, and about how that took place. We saw, and if you look at our notes in that chapter, we saw that that was all fulfilled back in 168 BC and the years following, where this Greek king ruling from Anatolia and modern day Antioch, rose up and lorded over the Jews and tried to do away with both their sacrifices and their form of worship. And he set up in the Jewish temple a pagan altar that rendered it desolate. It was an abomination that rendered it desolate to worship it. And that was all fulfilled. Daniel chapter 12, now suddenly we turn the page and we're seeing Michael and this, and notice it starts off now at that time, and yet it's a time of distress. And before we get out of here, we're going to see resurrection. And you say, when did that take place? There seems to be a divide between the subject matter of Daniel chapter 11 and Daniel chapter 12. Well, let's look at the rest of it. At that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress, such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. What is this time of distress that is being described? Obviously, when you look back at the history of Antioch the Fourth and what he did in the land of Judah as he came in and tried to turn them toward paganism, that was a time of distress. But notice, this is a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. So, to what does this time of distress refer? Is it merely summed up in the abomination of desolation brought about by Antiochus Epiphanes in 168 BC? Is that the time of distress? Moving forward, it's striking that when we get to the New Testament, we see Jesus quoting, and we're going to look at that in just a moment, that passage that talks about an abomination of desolation. And he says it's going to happen again. And it did. You have the destruction of the temple, the same temple that was standing there in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes would continue until 70 AD. It went through a major overhaul in the days of Herod the Great, but then was destroyed in 70 AD. And the very first thing that the Romans did when they burned the temple to the ground, they built an altar to their pagan god, and they offered a sacrifice to it. And I find it striking that if you go to Israel today and you go to the place where the temple used to stand, there is standing in its place a mosque that renders it desolate to Jewish worship. There, I don't mean to be mean when I say it, but it is an abomination of desolation. So is that the time of distress, or some people have looked at the final judgment and events leading up to that, some future time of distress, and those are the options. So, but which one is in view here? This time of distress. Now, when we look at the Septuagint is your very first translation of the Hebrew text, and you say, well, is that a good translation? Time of distress? Yes, it is. But when you look at the Septuagint, it renders it He Hemera Thlipsius. You could call this the day of trouble. There's a different rendition in some copies of the Septuagint. An alternate reading is Kairos Thlipsius, which would be a time of trouble. But notice that word trouble, Thlipsius. Distress works as well, trouble, or even tribulation. And the reason I mention that is in Matthew chapter 24. We said that Jesus actually references in this chapter the prophecy of Daniel the prophet. And he says, for then there will be a great, and he uses the same word here, a great thlipsis, a great tribulation, a great distress, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world. And then he adds, nor ever will. Matthew had actually talked about something they'd never seen before. Daniel talks about something they'd never seen before. And then Matthew adds, nor ever will. And we've already noted in our previous chapter that Josephus, the Jewish historian who was an eyewitness to the fall of Jerusalem, talked about how the entire nation was now shut up by fate as in a prison, and the Roman army encompassed the city when it was crowded with inhabitants accordingly. And this is the point that he makes. The multitude of those that therein perished exceeded all the destructions that either men or God ever brought upon the world. It's almost as though Josephus is quoting the book of Daniel, and he knows that. He's familiar with the book of Daniel, and he's calling that to mind to apply it to Jerusalem in his day. It's interesting that if you go to this picture is from Munich, Germany. My older brother lives there, and I remember the very first time we went and visited. He took me into one of these towers to see the view. It was sort of overcast, and so you couldn't see it. But it snowed that night, and the next day, the sky was clear, and you could see the mountains. That's the Alps to the south. And when you look at the Alps, it looks like just a solid table of mountains. I'm told that they refer to that. I don't know how you say it in German, but like a big giant train that's just covering the southern horizon. And then the last mountain there is sort of the caboose of the train. But what we did is the day after it had snowed, we drove up into the Alps. And getting there, something you couldn't see from far away, is that it's not just a solid chain of mountains, that once you pass the first mountain, there are valleys, beautiful, wide valleys in between the mountains. And when we look at fulfillments, prophetic fulfillments, we see that the same thing takes place. The prophet could not see the valleys, he could just describe the mountaintops. And so you have those near events, and then you have later events, and still later events. And the prophet does not note, very oftentimes, the time lapses between the peaks of the mountains. And so we have near events to the prophet, and then we have, from our perspective, we can talk about the first coming of Christ. He just talked about the coming of Messiah, the coming of the Lord. But we can now differentiate because now we've come into those valleys. The time has passed. We see it from perspective, where we have the first coming of Christ, and then that will be followed something that has not yet taken place, where Christ is going to come again. And the New Testament makes that very clear. It's the New Testament that exposes the valleys in between the mountain peaks, so that we can look at his prophecy here in Daniel chapters 11 and 12, and we can see how Daniel 11 describes Antiochus and the Maccabean revolt and their quest and gaining of independence, and how Antiochus had his fall. But then we notice that after that, you have the first coming of Christ, and that was followed, of course, by Titus and his destruction of the temple, that great desolation, that great time of trouble. And yet, there's also going to be a time of trouble, especially for those that don't believe, a time of trouble in the last day, when people stand before the Lord and stand before him in that final judgment. And so, if we look at the various sections of Daniel, these are places where we've seen the scope of history laid out. Daniel chapter 2, we had it was likened to a great statue. Daniel chapter 7, it was likened to beasts coming up out of the sea that represented these kings and kingdoms. In Daniel 8, there was a ram and a goat. Daniel 11, we didn't use any sort of images. We were just given the actual prophecies. And it started off in most of those cases with Babylon. It was the head in Daniel chapter 2. It was a lion in chapter 7. Daniel 8 and 11, it's not mentioned. Babylon was already had come and gone by that time. And then next we had the Medes and the Persians, represented in Daniel 2 by the breast and the arms, in chapter 7 by a bear, in chapter 8 as a ram with two horns. And that was explained how one horn was bigger than the other. And the Persian, you had the Medo-Persian Empire, but it was the Persians that were the ones that were really in charge. And in Daniel 11, it just describes some of the various kings of Persia. Next, you had the Greek Empire in Daniel 2, seen as the belly and the thighs. And in Daniel chapter 7, with the beast, it was a winged leopard, very quick, where Alexander the Great moved in short order. In Daniel 8, it was described as a he goat with a big old horn that did his deed. And in Daniel 11, he is described as a mighty king that arose. But then, after that fell, and his kingdom was not passed on to his posterity. Instead, it was divided up, and we saw how that took place. Next, we have two images, two personages, and we noticed we put a question mark. We asked, was it Antiochus, or was it something that took place in the days of Rome, where you had the legs and 10 toes? Notice the number 10 in Daniel chapter 7. You had 10 horns and a little horn that rises up and sort of does his thing. In Daniel 8, it doesn't mention the 10. Instead, it just mentions the small horn and what he does. And we looked at the commonality between chapter 7 and chapter 8. It's describing the same individual. And in Daniel 11, they're pictured, the focus is upon these kings of the north and the south. And one of the kings of the north becomes this willful king that goes in and sets up the abomination of desolation, and how that all took place. We continue to the end where those kingdoms were destroyed. In Daniel chapter 2, it was envisioned by the statue was toppled by a stone cut without hands. In Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days takes his seat and passes judgment. In Daniel 8, we see about how that little horn will be broken without human agency. In other words, he comes to an end not because the Jews figure out something in some way to bring him down, but God brings him down. And then in Daniel 11, we read that he will come to his end and no one will help him. That is followed by the eternal kingdom. In Daniel 2, we read that a new kingdom that will never be destroyed rises up. In Daniel 7, it's an everlasting kingdom. In Daniel 8, there's no mention of that. And in Daniel 11, actually, it comes into chapter 12. The rest of Daniel 11 is going to be found now in chapter 12, where we read that these arise to everlasting life, but others arise to everlasting contempt. We'll see that in just a moment. So we have this idea that there's a time of distress, and that everyone who is found written in the book will be rescued. And that idea of being written in a book is something we've seen all throughout the Old Testament. Exodus chapter 32, verse 33, where the Lord said to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book." And it doesn't describe what that is, but it sounds like a bad thing. Or Psalm chapter 69 and verse 28, and these are speaking of the enemies of God's people, may they be blotted out of the book of life, and may they not be recorded with the righteous. So the picture here is that God would have a book that represent his people, that have the names of his people. I don't know if we're talking about a literal book or symbolic of their end. Um, but notice the worst curse in Psalms is that they might be blotted out of the book of life and not recorded with the righteous. In Isaiah chapter 4 and verse 3, it will come about that he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy. And then it adds, everyone who is recorded for life. Notice the book is mentioned, but this idea of recording them, that God knows his people, that he records their name, that he might remember, not that God needs to remember, it's symbolic. It's showing that God will remember his people. And even Jesus speaks to this in Luke chapter 10 and verse 20. Nevertheless, he says, "Do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you." The disciples were really excited they'd been able to cast out demons and things like that. But Jesus says, "No, rejoice that your names are recorded in heaven," alluding to the same general idea. And there's coming a day when everyone who's found written in the book will be rescued, where the books are opened and judgment takes place, and those that are in the books find rescue and deliverance. And so in verse 2, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. I find this verse particularly striking because throughout the Old Testament, there are very few times where the writers of the Old Testament came out and specifically stated in very clear terms that there is life after death. Sometimes it is hinted at, sometimes it is alluded to, but here it seems to me that it becomes very specific. Those who sleep, and that this isn't just where they're taking a nap, those who sleep in the dust of the ground. That reminds us going all the way back to Genesis. From dust you were taken, and to dust you will return. It's a picture of death, but there's coming a day when they will awaken. And notice, some to everlasting life, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. And so notice there are those that rise to life, and also others that rise to something that is still arising, but it is a harsh, it is a negative judgment. And I don't mean by that judgment doesn't take place, but it is a judgment against them instead of for them. Verse 3, those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteous like the stars forever and ever. So that there are those who have insight, and the question is, are you one of those who have insight? But there are also, and they are also those who lead the many to righteous. And notice it's describing the same individuals. They both have insight, and they are also to extend that insight to others, leading them to righteousness. And that's a good thing. That's a beautiful picture. Verse 4, but as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Now, what does it mean to seal up the book? Put this away. Instead of publishing it, and I don't know how long it took before copies of Daniel were made. Our earliest copies go back to as early as the second century. Second century BC. Um, very, very early. And yet, notice it was to be sealed up. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. Every generation has looked at that phrase and said, "Look, knowledge has increased, in my lifetime, and certainly it has in mine as well." But people have been saying that for a long, 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 long time. And every generation, knowledge seems to increase that much more. Now, what's striking is when you get to the end of the book of Revelation, where John has his vision and he's writing things down, and he said to me, this is John speaking, "Do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near." Daniel had been told, We're not there yet." But John is told, no, now the time is near. And notice it was talking not just, today, 2021, but back in John's day, where he was stating that this was the case. And then verse 5, "Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on this bank of the river." And if you remember, Daniel had been in the neighborhood of the Tigris River. That's a very large river. But one on this bank of the river, and the other on that bank of the river. And one said to the man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river. So I take this, maybe I'm wrong, but I take this that here's one on one bank and the other on the other bank. Um, and perhaps that the river was being used to describe, look, we're not there yet. There has to be a crossing over before you see all these things take place. And so one says to the other, "How long will it be until the end of these wonders? When when comes, notice, when do we get to the end?" That's really the question before us. "As for me, I heard but could not understand. So I said, 'My Lord, what will be the outcome of these events?'" You almost want to hear the kid sitting in the back seat of the car. Are we there yet? you know, um, when, how does it all come to an end? How does the story end? Verse 9, he said, "Go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end time." He's already been told, seal up what you've been writing. We're not there yet. Verse 10, "Many will be purged, purified, and refined." This reminds me of what 2 Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 3 about how we are to regard the patience of the Lord as we look at, time passes, and it just like, isn't when is the Lord finally going to come? Has he delayed his coming? And we are to see that, to view that as the patience of the Lord. Because God is being patient, then many can be purged, purified, and refined. Now the flip side of that, "But the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand, but those who have insight will understand." And so notice these words are concealed, and they're sealed up until the end time. And we're not there yet, at least in Daniel's day, although let me just say we're closer. We're closer than Daniel was. We've come a long way. We're not home yet. Notice, until the end time. When comes the end? Verse 11, "From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up." And we saw that, wait a minute, that took place back in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, back in 168 BC. But then Jesus said, no, it's going to happen again. And it did happen again, 70 AD, where again there was an abomination of desolation, which stood there on the site of the temple. And I said sort of tongue in cheek, I don't mean necessarily this is a fulfillment of prophecy, but there is, in a sense, an abomination of desolation that's still there even to this day. But notice now we have a time frame mentioned. There will be 1,290 days. It's roughly about 3.5 years, maybe a little bit over, a little, Uh, but then verse 12, "How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days, or 1,335 days." And people say, what on earth is that? And commentators throughout the ages have come up with a variety of different ideas. And no one really agrees, which tells me no one really knows. And let me just say, my basic principle of interpreting biblical prophecy, the number one principle is this. Here it is. That prophecy is always easier to interpret after it has been fulfilled. Now that sounds sort of obvious, but you wouldn't think it's so obvious the way some people treat prophecy, and they've figured out, this thing and that thing and the other, um, and left no room for the mystery. But truthfully, there are things that have not yet been fulfilled, or at least have not yet been clarified, and so are still a mystery to us, and that's okay. That's okay. We're not done yet. Leave room for the mystery. And so we come to verse 13, but as for you, go your way, here's the word, to the end, whence comes the end. And then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. Notice what's being described here. The end. Go your way to the end, and then you'll enter into rest and rise again. I think Daniel is being told, you're not going to see it in your lifetime, but that doesn't mean you're not going to see it. Many years ago, my grandkids, they were much younger back then, not college students like they are today. But many years ago, we were at our house and we got out this board game, Monopoly. And I don't know if you've ever played Monopoly. It's about, you go round and round and collect money and then end up paying money and having money charged to you. And, it's sort of a little bit of a monotonous game. But we got to the end, and my granddaughter, she's the younger one. And my my grandson, I think, was maybe a little cutthroat. And we got to the end, and she had lost all of her. She lost the game. She had lost all of the money and the properties and so on. And and she was quite young. She started to cry a little bit, and I said, "Honey, that's okay. Look, at the end of the game, all the stuff, all the pieces and the properties and the money, it all goes back into the box." And life is a little bit like that too. We're so concerned about collecting this thing or that thing, or pursuing this dream or that one. And at the end, it all goes back into the box, even, even yourself. But that's not the end. And so God says to Daniel, but as for you, go your way to the end, and then you'll enter into the rest. But here's the rest of the story. And rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. Daniel had that hope of a future resurrection. And if you belong to the Lord and to his people, if you have come to Jesus Christ in faith and repentance, trusting in him as your Lord and Savior, then you have that hope too.